This month, we're asking for your support through our premium programs via the Escapist Plus and YouTube memberships. Your support allows us to continue making the content we want instead of chasing algorithms or the latest trends. Plus, you get a bunch of perks like ad-free viewing via the Escapist Plus on our main website, early access on YouTube via YouTube memberships. You can even ask us questions for our Ask the Creators video series. Thanks for all your support, whether it's with these programs or your general viewership. Everything great. Hey there, everybody. My name is Jack Packard.
I'm Darren Mooney.
And this week we're going to talk about Disney updating their content warning, a Willow announcement. I am going to wallow in the greatness of Willow as far as I see it. And then we will talk about the revamped Witches over on HBO Max? Is it HBO Max or HBO Plus?
It's HBO Max.
Now it's HBO Max.
Yes, it's going to be Paramount Plus. It's Disney Plus. I'm kind of assuming like Peacock's going to become NBC squared for maximum like brand value.
I love it. I love it. So that's what we're talking about this week on the Escapist Movie Podcast. Thanks for coming along. I don't ever do anything during these transitions because it's funnier just to like have me make the noises. So,
Jack Packard is the special effect.
It's true. It saves me a lot of time on editing.
And money.
So the first bit of news, this is probably going to be a short segment just because there's not a lot more we can add to it, but I still think it's a very interesting, is Disney has updated their content warning for some of their older animated features, specifically ones that had bad racist caricatures in them, which, to be fair, was most of them. And so they used to have a very small content warning that was just that said something like, oh, heads up, the thing you're about to watch has some insensitive things in it, bye. and now it's a little beefier.
It is. Well, I mean, again, this is one of those things where, you know, media companies are still navigating the sphere in which we operate. And again, the obligatory, before we jump into this discussion, this can neither be purely the beginning nor the end. This isn't the most important thing. Obviously, we're not saying it's the most important thing. But while acknowledging that it is not the most important thing in the cure to systemic racism and inequality, and it's not something that's going to magically fix the world, I quite like it. I think it's a good thing to do. And it's interesting, again, you mentioned HBO Max, because I remember one of the first times that I encountered a warning like this was actually, again, surprise, I'm a big film nerd and classic cartoon nerd. Who would have thought? But I used to buy those old DVDs that Warner's used to put out of the Looney Tunes. If you remember, they used to do box sets of the Essential Collections, which, if you can find them, are fantastic, and I wholeheartedly recommend them. They're arranged around particular characters, particular themes. So, you know, you got Bugs Bunny, you got Daffy, you got the Roadrunner, but around particular themes, you got like the propaganda cartoons from the Second World War. You got like classic ones, you got historical ones, stuff like that. And what they would do is, for the historical ones, they'd actually have introductions, and they'd be proper introductions from like celebrities like Whoopi Goldberg, who would actually be on a soundstage, which reminded me a lot of like the Academy Awards or the Emmys. It's just this big empty space with a screen behind them. And they'd talk about how depictions had changed and how they were a product of a different time and they existed in an entirely different context. But it's also important to allow audiences to be able to watch them, and therefore kind of has the best of both worlds, I think, with regards to this sort of stuff. This is the thing where you see a lot of controversy. I mean, recently there was Gone with the Wind, also on HBO Max, which generated a bit of controversy. It was pulled from the service, and then obviously as a result of being pulled from the service, it became a huge thing where everybody argued that all of a sudden they were being censored, even though it was still available to buy, like on Vudu, on Google Play, on iTunes, on every other service where you could possibly want it. It just temporarily was not available to stream for free from HBO Max.
That's exactly
when
what censorship is. Yes.
That is that's impinging my freedom of speech. I mean, I feel like the fact that I cannot watch Wonder Woman 84 on HBO Max right now is a form of censorship.
Absolutely.
What are they hiding? What are they doing? What secrets are they hiding? What's wrong with it? You know, they're coming down. They're trying to stop me from enjoying it as it was meant to be enjoyed. But no. More seriously though, the point I was kind of building to there is that what HBO Max did is something that I really, really like, is that they prepared an introduction with, I think it was Jacqueline Stewart, who's actually the Turner Classic Movies host and a film scholar. So somebody who actually understands the history of cinema. And she would, you know, when you watch Gone with the Wind on HBO Max, you have a brief, unskippable introduction from her in which she provides the context for the film. And actually, ironically, this is something that I would like just in general, in that I don't think, you know, I think it would be great if most movies came with an introduction from a film scholar that was like a minute long, and it's just like, you're about to watch this thing. Here's why this thing is important. Here's what you might need to know going in. You know, for several reasons. First of all, you know, knowledge is good. The more you know, knowledge is power. You know, knowing is half the battle. All those cliches. You know, second of all, you know, I think that movies are great when put in their context, and you know, not just problematic movies in terms of talking about things like race, for example, but even in terms of understanding why movies could or couldn't show particular things, or why particular choices are made, or why this movie changed this detail that you've probably seen done differently elsewhere. That sort of stuff. I think that's worth including as well. And, you know, third of all, well, film critics need to eat, right? And, you know, this is not necessarily a good economy for everybody. And there's a lot of that sweet, sweet streaming service money going around. So maybe just throw a couple of that film critics to give some background
work for
info.
cheap, absolutely. Well, you need me to introduce something? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'll introduce, like, you know, He-Man, Master of the Universe, if you pay me in a sandwich. Like, just give me, it's got to be a nice sandwich, but I will introduce it if you need me to.
Quality bread.
But, like, I don't think that there's anything wrong with the introduction. I think that, you know, they're good. I think they're necessary. This is where it gets kind of interesting, though, because it's on Disney Plus, where you have the debate over things like Song of the South. Where Song of the South, for very obvious reasons. And I mean, if you don't know what those reasons are, just Google Song of the South and it'll become very evident very quickly. But if you want more in-depth stuff, actually, Karina Longworth's podcast, You Must Remember This, did like a whole 6-episode season on it, which I would recommend, because somehow it's even worse than you think it is.
It's worse than we remember. Wait, what's the name of that podcast again?
You Must Remember This. She did 6 degrees of Song of the South, which is great because I like alliteration. Who doesn't like alliteration? It's awesome. But yeah, but like, Disney's Song of the South will never be available on its streaming services. It's not available on DVD. It won't be available on Blu-ray. And that's an interesting debate around it, because I think this gets at something that's slightly more complicated than like putting a Reviso on it, because as somebody who likes film history, as somebody who appreciates film history and thinks that film history should be preserved, I think that in general, most things should remain available. You should be able to have access to, particularly if you were a film scholar, or particularly if you're, you know, a writer, or you're studying film or something like that, you should have access to this material. And things like the Disney Vault and things like Song of the South are interesting because they're not necessarily aimed at older audiences. That's where I think it gets complicated. When the media that has these outdated portrayals that, you know, are, and let's be honest here, like Song of the South and Gone with the Wind, like, they're not, it's not that like they were fair for the time and history has now looked back on them negatively. It's like, no, in like 1938 and in the 1940s, these were still pretty bad. Like the NAACP were like protesting these movies, writing letters about these movies at the time.
Disney chose a side back then. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. To be clear, like, it's not as if we're casting judgment like with the benefit of history and going, this is not okay. People were saying this was not okay at the time as well. But like, I think one of the interesting debates about this sort of censorship is the question about media for kids and about access to media for kids. Because I think that things like, say, a DVD of those Looney Tunes that I mentioned, right? Those are for me, a grown-ass man who likes cartoons, but also cartoon history. You know, they're not going to be bought. They're a specialty item. They're not going to be picked up by a, you know, 4-year-old child who comes toddling down the aisle going, Mummy, can you buy me the Looney Tunes Archive number 7? It's got all my favorite World War II propaganda cartoons on it. So I kind of like, I understand putting them on that. I think it gets a bit dicier when you get to something like Disney Plus, where you assume the target market for Disney Plus is like kids rather than film scholars. So that's where I think it gets interesting.
Right. Well, and speaking to specifically that point, you have kids who are able to browse Disney Plus and see Peter Pan and
Yeah.
see the Aristocats and see
Dumbo.
Dumbo. Oh, Dumbo.
Oh
Holy
yeah.
Dumbo. Um,
The crow is actually called Jim Crow.
I I just learned that when I was reading articles about this, because I always knew the crows were voiced by white people and very racist. But then you learn that the crow's name is actually Jim Crow, which, for any non American listeners, were racist laws passed here back in the days of segregation. It's, yes, fun and crazy. And so, like, Disney kind of has this, like, there's even a way to look at it to say that Disney has a bit of a half-assed approach to these content warnings, which is now a very long content warning, and even a website you can go to, which is disney.com/storiesmatter, where presumably you can see why.
That's some nice cross-branding there. If you were being slightly cynical, you'd be like, yep, the marketing team worked hard on that one.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. But it's also something that can very easily be ignored, especially if you have a very young kid watching one of these. And so I really like your idea of or not your idea, but the idea of the unskippable intro. That to me would actually give things context. And I know, like we talked about when we were discussing Hubie Halloween and me having to explain slightly not age appropriate jokes to my children. I truly believe that movie night can be the spark of a really good conversation. I know with my kids, we're a political household here, so we watch the debates and we listen to National Public Radio, and our kids listen along with, and we have sometimes very difficult conversations trying to explain grown-up problems to children in a way that they will both understand and empathize with. And so, like, to me, like, content warnings are a Band-Aid right now. I'm glad they're there. I'm glad, like, it's something. Like you said, it's not a fix. It's the least they can do, which is anything.
Yes. So... like Disney, you're like, it's the least we could do, and we're like, we know.
You understand that is our problem.
What I do find interesting, and then this is kind of like gets into a broader debate, which is probably not something to unpack in the podcast, but sure, I'm just going to throw it out there anyway and have some fun with it. But what's interesting about, like, Disney in particular, about the way that they do this, and again, this is where it's going to seem like Darren complains about Disney regular podcast feature. It should have its own theme song. I'm not sure I'm actually complaining so much as I am, like, actually legitimately fascinated by how they do this. You could argue that a large part of what Disney has been trying to do for the past 10 to 15, arguably going back 20 or 30 years, is to look at these existing, what you would call problematic intellectual properties with these uncomfortable undertones, and trying to find a way to repackage them for consumption without those elements included. So things like, for example, the live-action adaptation of Dumbo, which effectively gives the company a version of Dumbo that you could show to your kids if you, didn't care about quality, and I say that quite liking Dumbo, but also B, wanted to avoid conversations about the Jim Crow character. But even things like, you want to take Song of the South, for example, a lot of the Song of the South characters and iconography still, until recently existed on the Splash Mountain ride. And up until the most recent, like, outburst or outbreak, the kind of discussion around this stuff, people hadn't noticed it because they'd managed to take those characters, those concepts, those songs even, out of the context of, like, a deeply, deeply troubling and unsettling history, and just drop them into something that they could kind of package and sell. And I think that it's interesting that with the content warning, at least you are forcing Disney to, like, confront or acknowledge that rather than kind of avoid it or work around it. Which is, and again, it's an interesting side effect of what we've talked about in a general trend in media, and we're probably going to get to in the next section, which is this idea of, like, packaging content that you already have and expanding it and selling it, and then hopefully allowing you to continue selling and marketing that intellectual property, which may not have been successful the first time around, maybe problematic in its original form, but still is pretty good for that bottom line, which is, again, incredibly cynical, incredibly calculated.
But we're talking about Disney here, and that's literally, like, they are a business of intellectual properties at this point.
They're very good at it.
Very good exactly.
Like, again, like, I sound like I'm complaining, and I kind of am, but they're very good at it. They got game.
They do, and this goes back to earlier releases. I was again reading all of these lovely articles written about the new content warnings, and Peter Pan, the old animated Peter Pan, is of course on the docket for a content warning because of stereotypical depictions of Native Americans. And they actually, like, one of the original songs was even more racist, and they kind of changed the words way back in the day to be slightly less racist, but still very racist enough to need a content warning. And so, like, they have been slowly morphing throughout the decades to continue selling that product. Absolutely.
Well, I mean, like, that was the original plan with Fantasia, which, again, Fantasia is, like, for my mind, one of the best things Disney ever did, but it's also the most typical of what Disney wanted to do. The idea with Fantasia was that you would keep releasing it in perpetuity, and you would just take bits out, put new bits in their place, and you would have a product that would continually, like, recycle and renew itself. And I think, again, this is the thing where we get into the old film preservation thing that's going on. I think, like, Matt Zoller-Seitz has written about this, where, like, one of the first things that Disney did when it bought Fox was to basically take a whole host of Fox crap and put it in the vault. I know people who, for example, cannot screen Fight Club because it's owned by Fox and Disney will no longer organize screenings of it.
Really?
Yeah, which is interesting. It's very interesting because all that stuff is kind of bundled away. And stuff like, for example, old Fox movies falling out of circulation because Disney isn't as interested in physical media and because the brand doesn't fit on Disney Plus. So, where's it going to go? It's just going to stay in limbo. I think there is something to be said for at least the content warnings forcing us to acknowledge that things were the way that they were, rather than erasing it or pretending that they weren't. So acknowledging that, in the past, these depictions happened. And as you point out, being a conversation. Because that's the thing. Like, it's important to actually talk about these things and not just erase them, smooth them over, buff them out. It's like, things were different in the past. Like, and that doesn't mean that Peter Pan isn't a beautiful piece of animation, because it is. It doesn't mean that Dumbo can't be, like, heartwarming and hilarious and funny and kind of amusing. It doesn't mean that Pinocchio isn't a great film to watch with your kids. But it does mean that, you have to acknowledge that there are probably some elements of that you need to have a conversation about. And there's nothing wrong with a conversation. Like, that's it exactly. That's what I don't get about, like, people getting upset about this. It's like, it's the best of all worlds. You get the original film, and, like, you can talk about it if you need to, which is
most
great.
people don't want to talk to their kids. Okay, that's a
just in general. I like that.
Just in general, like,
WhatsApp groups are great. It's like dinner. Done. It's like,
well, no, and I, like, if we're gonna go full cynical on this, like, really, Disney needs to start looking at ways to monetize the controversies. Like, if Disney could produce their own companion documentaries about Song of the South and sell that along with Song of the South.
Yeah. And training courses as well, and, like, sort of, that's it, like sharing conversations that you pay out like $1,000 a piece, probably to large companies as well. And it's like, that's the dream for Disney, which is great. That's
beautiful.
I know. After this podcast, Jack and Darren were both hired by Disney.
We're going to be in charge of so it's time to talk to your kids about racism.
Songs of the South. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, no, and so like the basic wrap up here is, like, it is something that's great, but also don't be afraid to talk to your kids about old weird racist shit. It's interesting.
Yeah. And it can be a learning moment for you as well. I say as somebody who doesn't have kids, so I feel like I'm lecturing both. It's great.
No, it is. It's really interesting when you try to break down something that is seemingly very complicated, and you try to break it down so a kid will understand it. You actually end up finding out that this big complicated thing is really not that complicated. It's just bad people doing bad things for money. Like, that's what it always boils down to, by the way. So there you go. There's my cynicism for the day.
Yeah, right. right there. All right, kids, time for dessert.
Time for dessert. Now let's watch Willow.
Yeah.
No problems with Willow. So let's move on here, Darren, and talk about a movie that I unironically love. I haven't seen it in quite some time. I rewatched it yesterday. I still love it. I know it's not a perfect movie, but I still love Willow. The time George Lucas tried, failed, and never tried again. The big news, the reason why we got to watch this is because Disney Plus announced a new sequel Willow series is in production. We can only assume Warwick Davis is coming back to reprise his role as the titular Willow. It's a big dumb fantasy movie. It has Kevin Pollak and Val Kilmer, who's mostly shirtless the whole time. It's like a weird take on Lord of the Rings, where, you know, Aragorn is a buffoon. Willow is such a beautiful movie, even though I know it's kind of bad. I still really love it.
It's very much a post-Princess Bride movie in a lot of senses. I think when you mentioned that idea of kind of like the character of Mad Madigan being very much like a buffoon character and kind of like comic relief as well.
Yes.
This is interesting because I think I may have... This is one of those things like Hocus Pocus where I feel like I missed the perfect window to see it as a child. Where it's like, I feel like I was either too young or too old when I saw it for the first time. And so I have that reaction to it where it's kind of like, it's like I can appreciate that, like, technically it's quite well made. I love the actual physical production. There's a sequence where there are thousands of men marching down the road and there are like literally hundreds of extras and you're like, wow, they don't do that anymore. It's amazing. Or like sequences where characters are dragged across like tropical terrain and kind of like temperate terrain and snowy terrain. And you're like, I know they spent several hours on a plane to make that happen. And it's like, yep, they just don't make movies like this anymore. And I like Warwick Davis as well in it, but it's an odd movie for me in a number of ways because it feels, it's strangely leaden when I watch it. It always feels longer than it is.
And it's long. It's a long movie. Yeah.
It's 2 hours and 8 minutes, which like in 1988 time is like 4 hours.
Yes.
Because like back in the day, like a solid summer blockbuster was like 88 minutes, maybe 100 at a push, and you're out. It's like, none of this. This was like a proper beefy film. And it's very episodically structured. And again, this is the thing where, like, again, you mentioned George Lucas, who was a huge driving force. You can see across the entire film in ways both good and bad. You know, in terms of like, you know, in terms of good stuff, it's very much like a, you know, Campbellian epic old-fashioned story. It's got clear-cut heroes. It's got like an archetypal rogue. It's got a villain wearing a cool mask. It's got all these sort of things going on, but in bad ways, in the sense that, like, watching it now, I was like, is Kevin Pollak doing some sort of vaguely ethnic accent in that like comedic supporting role?
I think it's supposed to be French. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, this is like, so it's like, don't worry, next time I think I'm going to do it with Afro-Caribbean, but it's going to be entirely computer generated. And you're like, I'm not sure that's a good idea, George. It's like, but it works so well in Willow. But yeah, like, and kind of like, it's structured much like the original Star Wars, which is very episodic in a way that evokes kind of the classic old-fashioned serials. So it's like they go to one place and then something happens, and they go to another place and something else happens. And then there are trolls, and then there's an army, and then they have to go back at the climax. And again, it's again, that structure that worked for Star Wars, where it's like, you got to save the princess, got to infiltrate the Death Star, got to get out of the Death Star, got to get to the, you know, to the base on Yavin, got to get back and blow up the Death Star again. And it's like, yeah, this is because Lucas grew up watching films that were designed in 7-minute installments to play before the movies that he actually wanted to see. It's like, yeah, I can see that there.
The big downfall for Willow, if we're going to compare it to Star Wars, is he had divorced his wife by that point, so she couldn't edit it and fix it. Yeah.
Yes. Well, again, watching Willow, again, this is the thing where I was also not a Star Wars kid. So like again, I miss Star Wars at that perfect point. I like Star Wars a lot. I appreciate it for what it does. I have a lot of affection. I would argue The Empire Strikes Back is one of the great American movies before the internet comes for me, to be absolutely clear. But like watching Willow, you get a sense of like how much had to align perfectly for Star Wars to work. Like how much, if anything, was just like a centimeter off left or right, it wouldn't click. So it's like in Willow, you have all these characters who are transparently like analogs of Star Wars characters. So you have like General Kale, who is like transparently Darth Vader because he wears a cool skull helmet and he's an enforcer and he's a brute and he works for this old British character actor, much like Vader does in the original Star Wars, except this time he has absolutely no physical presence. He has absolutely no like impressive voice. He's just there. You have the character of Mad Madigan, and I know I'm going to upset, and I apologize in advance for this, Jack, and Willow fans on the podcast stream, but like you have Mad Madigan, who's played by Val Kilmer, and Val Kilmer, I personally maybe do not care for Val Kilmer, just like in general.
Shut your mouth.
I know, right? But okay, even if we accept that maybe Val Kilmer is good, and in fact, actually, I would argue Val Kilmer has never been better than he was doing the press tour for the Willow Blu-ray release with Warwick Davis. Like, that was beautiful. The two of them together, just fantastic. And in fact, actually, they did an episode of Life is Short, the sitcom with Warwick Davis, which was absolutely lovely, and it's probably my second favorite thing Val Kilmer's done. So, I mean, you know, generally speaking, like, putting him with, you know, Warwick Davis is a good sign in my books. But even if we accept that, you know, Mad Madigan is good, and Val Kilmer is good, let's accept that as a basis. He is also not Harrison Ford. We will also accept that. He is not Han Solo. There is a, like, quantum leap in terms of, like, actually reaching the next level of, like, roguish charm that you get with Harrison Ford that I think it's fair to say you don't get with Val Kilmer as Madigan and stuff like that.
I can definitely agree with that. I think Willow is a weird balance where, you know, like it's an action heavy, you know, epic adventure, but they also wanted to up the kid friendliness of it. And so you have Mad Madigan falling down a lot, you know, after he does cool sword stuff.
And is in drag, because it's an 80s movie. And it's like, Dustin Hoffman won an Oscar for Tootsie, let's do this thing.
Like, in drag, getting felt up, which is uncomfortable to watch, yeah.
And, like, with his face on mask with, like, a 5 o'clock shadow, and the other guy doesn't get it either. Like, which is, yeah, it's a strange movie.
No, and, you know, a lot of this, I think, really could have been fixed in editing. I think, like, just a lot of chopping. I know, like, if you've ever seen any of A New Hope before it got re-edited, it has the very same overlong, over-ambly feel to it. Interesting. This was a big picture for Ron Howard. You know, Ron Howard directed the movie. Ron Howard is the ultimate utility director as far as I am concerned, which is also meaning to say he has absolutely no personality as a director.
I will stand up for Ron Howard. Ron Howard gets a lot of flack for being very generic and very bland and being a competent workman. Like, I imagine he showed up to the set of Solo, or the former set of Solo that he was going to have to fix with a host of close-ups and CGI, wearing a toolman's belt, and was like, okay, let's take a measurement and let's get this bad boy fixed. I will say that, like, I think Ron Howard is a terrible fit for Willow, because Howard is not... And I want to be careful about this, because this is very similar to the discussion we had about Bob Zemeckis a couple of weeks ago, where we're like, how do we say that, you know, the, you know, directors of the 70s taking large amounts of cocaine was bad, but also maybe contributed to the movies that they created? Because it's like, Ron Howard has talked about how when he was learning how to direct and he was working on Happy Days, the rest of the cast would go out like drinking, boozing, and implicitly doing other stuff as well. And Howard was just like, I've had a long day at work. I'll go for one, and then I'll clock out and I'll go home to my wife and we'll just cuddle and it'll be nice. And you're like, that is the most adorable story. I love that about Ron Howard. And it's like, you look at Ron Howard's best films, and I would argue there are movies like Rush or say Frost Nixon or even Apollo 13. Those are all movies about guys who do exactly what is expected of them when it's expected of them. It's about competent people. It's about people who know how to work in the system in which they're placed. And it's like, Ron, I think maybe there's a reason that you sort of radiate towards the weird little German racer who like gets out his measuring tape and figures out that the Formula One car his rival is driving is too wide and therefore wins by default. I think there's maybe a reason why you, more than any other director, are drawn to that character rather than like shirtless, Chris Hemsworth who's making out with Natalie Dormer in your opening scene. It's like maybe that's kind of where you need to pitch yourself, because like watching Willow. You mentioned like the kind of the leaden pacing, and even a lot of the framing and stuff. It seems like he's not entirely comfortable with this kind of epicness, with this kind of epic world. Like he shoots, like the fight scenes at the end are awkward and jumbly and kind of terribly cut together. He does a lot of handheld shaky cam that doesn't really work because it's not something that he's good at. And yeah, it never really kind of clicks it in a way that it should. And it's a shame because I think the best part of the movie and what I actually love about the movie, and you mentioned this being like a very kid-friendly, the edges smoothed off like movie. I adore Warwick Davies as Willow, particularly in the opening scenes where he's like the default 80s movie protagonist, where he's like, I'm a farmer.
Yes.
I'm out farming. There's a cute, adorable baby that's just washed up. I know this baby's trouble, so I am just gonna push it away, let it go downstream, and if it gets eaten by a bear, it's somebody else's problem. It's not my problem. And I kind of like. Davis is great. I think he was only like 17 or 18, even though he plays like a married father here. But he's so good. And like, that's the best part of the film, is the fact that like Willow is an ordinary dude who like just happens to get swept up in all this nonsense happening around him. Like, I get the sense that like Ron Howard was a terrible choice to direct a Han Solo movie, but Ron Howard would be a great choice to direct a Luke Skywalker movie. Because I think that, like, Luke Skywalker, sort of being a mellow dude who just, like, wants to be cool. Like, who just wants to, like, relax and not be stressed about anything, not be badass, just go about his business, maybe become a moisture farmer in the end or something. Right. That's Ron Howard's bag.
Ron Howard would be perfect to direct an Obi-Wan Kenobi movie. Like when Obi-Wan Kenobi was incognito and probably had to pick up a regular job and like does like the special thing maybe once, but is just a regular dude doing regular things. Yes, that's who needs to direct the Obi-Wan movie. That I'm sure will happen eventually. And a lot of that is really evident, like you said, with the fight scenes, with the special effects that we get. Everything is just it's utility, and like I really like Ron Howard as a director. I call him a utility director, both as praising him and as making fun of him. But like, this is also someone whose first movie was a Roger Corman movie. Like, not only did he learn to direct watching his own TV show be made, but then he got like schooled by the greatest schlock auteur of our generation, of any generation. And so like, he knows how to make a movie. He knows how to make a movie tight, but he has no flair. And so we get like to these wonderful and horrifying moments, because again, it is a family movie, but there is a sequence in the movie where Willow hits a monkey-looking troll with a spell. That troll rips its own flesh off and morphs into a giant two-headed dragon. And like, that's what I remember growing up. Yeah. And it feels very flat and very surgical,
I kind of like it. Reminded me, you mentioned Corman, it reminded me of Harryhausen, actually. It had this very Harryhausen effect, which is maybe not what they were going for when George Lucas was like, I had to wait until 1988 to make this movie. And you're like, really, George? It feels like you could have done the claymation a little bit earlier if you wanted to. And yet, to be fair to like Howard, I joked earlier that he's not who you'd hire to direct a kind of a Han Solo movie. He is probably the best director who could have been hired for what Disney wanted him to do, which was to make something a functional movie from the mess that they had. Like, I don't think Solo is a good movie, but I think it's the best possible movie it could have been after Disney fired Lord and Miller. And I think that that's largely down to the fact that Howard was a man with a lot of sticky tape.
He's a utility man. And I mean, I will forever be upset that we don't get Lord and Miller's bizarre take on Solo, as I'm sure it would have been. Capes. Like, it would have been bad. It would have been so bad. It would have been so bad on purpose, because that's what Lord and Miller does. They do such interesting work. But I can see with you. They needed a fixer. They needed someone to put their broken toy back together.
I'm not arguing that they should have fired Lord and Miller. I'm just saying, like, if you're in that situation, like, if I've walked into the Disney like boardroom and they're like, we just fired Lord and Miller from Solo, we need the movie reassembled from scratch. I'm like, I can understand why the first person you pick out of the Rolodex is Ron Howard. You know,
Fix
like,
it
no.
and do it on budget. He will do it on budget, on time, and make a competent movie. Absolutely.
Yeah, so I've got Josh Trank in the other hand here, and it's like, no.
Oh God. Why is that even in the Rolodex? It just keeps falling back in.
Yeah, we got that from Fox. It's like, yeah.
Oh God, throw it away.
Yeah.
Throw it right away. But so like getting back to the Willow-ness of it is like, it is the first 2 acts of this movie are meandering and overly long and arguably very, very boring. But once you get to the troll ripping its own flesh off, it is a roller coaster, because then we have epic battles, we have people turning into pigs, we have a wizard battle.
My favorite detail about that, by the way, and I don't know if we have any young listeners of a delicate sensibility, but they may want to tune out for the next 30 seconds. Apparently, in that sequence where Jane Marsh turns them all into pigs in front of the castle, the pigs that they got to film that were enthusiastic and very friendly towards one another. And apparently between takes, they had to keep hosing them down with cold water in order to separate them. Which I kind of like again, Warwick Davis, he does the commentary for this on the DVD, and it's such a good commentary. But yeah, like that little detail I love. And there's also, like, you mentioned the fact the first 2 acts are kind of meandering and wandering. Like, there's a minor, and I hate the term plot hole because it's not really a plot hole, but like the fact that he's given 3 acorns at the start that turn people into stone if he throws them, and he only uses 2 of them on screen, but the second one is treated like it's his last one. The reason that is because there was an entire sequence in the middle of the film where he was trying to cross a river and got attacked by a fish monster, and he used the second acorn during that sequence, but they cut that because they were like, this doesn't add anything to the plot. And like, the only way that you would know that they had cut this entire like elaborate 10-minute special effects sequence from the movie is because there's now a plot hole about the number of acorns. I also apparently like, and again, this is one of the things where it's like, you mentioned the power of editing and what gets cut and what doesn't. Like, a lot of the backstory of the characters, like Mad Madigan, for example, and Sorsha, like, their backstories apparently got trimmed from the movie as well. And like, you're watching it and you're like, why do I care about these people in particular, outside the fact that maybe Val Kilmer is hypothetically charming? I'll throw that one. I'll give that out. I'll give that out to the world.
Batman. He is so charming.
A lot of people were Batman, Jack. But yeah, like, I'll give you that one. I'll say maybe he's charming, but it's like, there's no root in the character. There's nothing to care for about the character. And you're like, you read up on the backstory or you hear about deleted scenes and you're like, why isn't that in the movie? Why wouldn't you tell us about Sorsha's relationship with her mother and her father, which explains her character motivation in suddenly switching sides? Why wouldn't you tell us about Madigan's like backstory that is basically like goofy comic relief Aragorn? Why wouldn't you give us that information in the movie that we got, instead of like another episodic adventure along the way?
Right. Like, and you know, they give a lot of time to Willow's village, the internal politics of the village, whether or not Willow is a proper magician, or like they give so much time to that, which, like, I guess good for you because Willow's our main character, but there's other characters in the movie.
And all the people who accompany Willow on his mission, and then just gotta shrug their shoulders and say, feck it, I'm done, I'm out, I'm heading back. It's like I feel like you could tighten this just a little bit.
How much time was spent on figuring out exactly who was going with him and exactly who was then leaving 10 minutes later? Yes. Right. No, there's problems abound.
I'm not kicking the movie when it's down. Like, I don't think it's an awful movie or anything like that. Like, I think there's a lot of fun to be had with it. It's an interesting movie.
Like to me, and like hopefully this will speak well to anyone who is like a Dungeons and Dragons fan. But to me, this is like just cliff notes from George Lucas GMing a campaign for Val Kilmer and Warwick Davis, because like you have very bizarre things happening that are very emblematic of a D&D campaign. You know, you have Mad Madigan rolling a nat 20 on a charisma check to woo Sorsha, right? Like why?
Not at all creepy while she's sleeping as well.
To be fair, she kidnapped him first. So
yeah, I mean, it's all fair, right? It just balances out. That's another Batman line. So you kidnap me, I kidnap you.
I do. I love it that in the final movie, like she finally realized she loved him because of his sweet sword moves, or like right in the middle of this deep battle, all of her side versus like the two of them, and she just is watching Val Kilmer going, "Wow, he's really good at that sword. I think I love him."
I mean, does he really have that much else going for him, Jack? And also, there's probably a statement to be made there about the level of character development in the film, where that feels about right.
Like I said, he rolled that nat 20 on his charisma check, and that's why it happened. I'm trying to think of like the weird wizard fight at the end. I love. I
kind of like the weird lizard fight. That's a very different movie. I quite like the weird wizard fight at the end, because it gives you the idea that like Willow is, and this sounds like it's I need to phrase this carefully, but it's like George Lucas has talked about how so many of his movies are about the little man versus the system. And like there's a point where he says, and I wanted to literalize that with Willow, and you're like, George, I'm not sure that's a cool thing to say.
Absolutely not.
But like the way in which Willow is he's the protagonist of the movie, but at the end he is quite literally just a bystander in this epic struggle, in the sense of like all he does is do this tiny little magic trick that gets the baby away, which is the thing that you saw him do at the start with the pig. And it's like that. I think that's very clever. I think that's like quite a clever way to do, as you pointed out, in your riff on Lord of the Rings. If you're doing a riff on Lord of the Rings, it's like, actually, this is a nice little, and again, that word that makes some people very angry, subversion of kind of genre tropes, where it's like, what's Willow's function here at the end? He doesn't even partake in the epic wizard battle. He just kind of observes and does like a cute little magic parlor trick. He's just a bystander observer. And I actually, like, as far as the movie is structured, I genuinely like that decision. I think it's a clever one.
Well, and it makes sense because his character hasn't leveled up yet, and so he can only still do his level 1 tricks. But like there's so much heart, especially with Willow's character. Like the elongated scenes, or the elongated shots at the end when he is reunited with his wife and kids. It was like a genuinely heartfelt moment, all for this weird little character. And
but that's your Ron Howard moment. That's like the best part for Ron Howard. The best part of an epic journey is when you get to come home at the end of the day, and it's like I had a pint with the lads. I had a drink with the lads at the bar, and I'm home now. This is great. This is the best part of my day. And you're like, Ron, I kind of adore you, even if I don't trust you to direct my epic movies.
Well, to be fair, this was his first big epic movie, and I don't know how many epic movies he directed after that.
I did like In the Heart of the Sea is probably his most recent one, which was his big Moby Dick one, which was not great. Not great. And then there's his big Inferno trilogy with Tom Hanks, which the Da Vinci Code and stuff like that, which I would argue are enjoyable if you approach them in the right frame of mind, which is to imagine that they are basically what would happen if your grandpa was asked to direct like an epic sort of like spy chaser adventure. There's a moment in the third one which is amazing where like Tom Hanks has to splash in a pool and like cause chaos. Or there's a moment where he's chased through a public park by a drone, and it's really annoying. And the end of the last, and again, this is a minor spoiler, if you're not watching the Inferno, skip ahead 30 seconds, but there's a moment at the end of Inferno where Tom Hanks, America's dad, proves how much of a rebel/rogue he is by breaking into a museum and replacing a priceless artifact there without anybody realizing. And like literally the moment's like the security guard's like, what happened? Hey, was that there before? And then we just cut to Tom Hanks smirking as he walks out the door. It's like, yep, he is the most ordinary badass. Most middle-aged badass imaginable. It's like,
Absolutely. That's great. Well, then, like, and so yeah, very possibly the wrong director to Willow, but like the other part of it, the other part of Willow to me is it is, and the reason that I'm really excited that they are giving it a sequel, spin-off series, however you want to phrase that, is like, one, I genuinely enjoy weird fantasy stuff, so I'm really looking forward to that. But also, Willow is a movie that is unlike any other movie ever made, both in who they cast as their protagonists and in its general feel. It is unlike any other movie, and it exists in this beautiful little pocket. And so I'm glad that they're giving it a new lease on life, so more people can discover just how weird fantasy was in the 80s.
And I will say, actually, it's being directed, or it's being showrun apparently by John M. Chu. I know that John M. Chu, obviously he directed, he's done a bunch of other stuff that's, not really particularly important. He directed G.I. Joe Retaliation, which is one of the worst and also most interesting blockbusters of the 2010s. But he also directed Crazy Rich Asians, which I would argue is one of the best rom-coms of the decade. And so has that kind of like what you might describe as that Ron Howard energy. So I'm kind of like, I can see this. I can see Willow from the director of like, Crazy Rich Asians kind of feeling similar to Willow from like, the guy from Happy Days.
Sure. Interesting. That's very interesting to me that they're not giving it to someone a little more
Fantasy or action
based.
based. Well, I mean, maybe they're considering G.I. Joe Retaliation as the like audition for it, which they really shouldn't. But like, I'm really hoping that we get Crazy Rich Asians version. That's what I'm hoping. It's like, that's the best case scenario. Willow from the director of Crazy Rich Asians.
Right, and it's just like he's probably a powerful sorcerer now, but he still has to deal with family stuff. Wah, wah.
Yeah, very Ron Howard energy.
Classic Ron Howard energy. That's great. That's great. Well, let's take that Ron Howard energy. Let's take our talk of revamping old properties and take a look at The Witches, which is a new do you call it a remake of the old movie or a new remake
Adaptation
of the book? Right.
I just call it bad, is what I call it. No, okay.
So before we get into spoilers, it's very boring.
It's incredibly lifeless. Again, this is that we talked a couple of weeks ago about Bob Zemeckis when the trailer came out, and we were like, maybe this will be like Bob Zemeckis making a kids movie. Maybe he'll reconnect with this kind of like the energy of the 80s movies that we loved him making, or even some of the 90s movies he loved him making. And it's like, you're watching it, and it's like, no, I immediately understand, and without any spoilers, but I immediately understand watching this version of The Witches why Bob Zemeckis was drawn to it, and they are exactly the wrong reasons. It's like, it's going to be set in the 60s, Bob, like Forrest Gump, and it's like, yeah, I can do that. By the way, when we're recreating the 60s, we want you to use a lot of CGI and hypersaturation to make it feel unreal. Like most of your recent movies, including The Walk. It's like, yeah, I can do that. And it's like, okay. And then after that, what we're thinking is that maybe, the movie's about a kid who, and again, this isn't really a spoiler, but like maybe gets turned into or maybe there's some transformation. There's some cute little animals that talk in the film. And it's like, can I render them in CGI? It's like, yes, you can, Bob. Does the CGI have to be photorealistic or convincing? Not necessarily. We're not really in there. It's like, fine, I'll do it. I'll make it happen. And it's like, those are exactly the wrong things to focus on when making an adaptation of this book and this story. And yeah, it's the bad Bob Zemeckis, I'm afraid to say.
It's really, really dull. I remember like our conversation about kind of the original adaptation and how you were talking about kind of falling in love with that idea of the big weird hotel, and like how, even though I still think the original film version is generally boring,
This is payback for Willow, isn't it?
Well,
my childhood movie is better than your childhood movie.
I understand where you're coming from.
I'm kidding.
Is like the first film definitely had that like elongated sequences of exploring this weird, creepy hotel, and that adding to the tension. In the new version of the movie, they just forego all that and have literally no exploration of the big creepy hotel. Instead, they spend so much time they spend so much time with no witches is my big problem.
There's so much time on backstory and mythology. And again, like, this is one of the things where, at the risk of generalizing, I wonder if it's a result of trying to adapt what's a quintessentially British text for an American audience. And before we talk about the bad stuff, let's talk very quickly about the good stuff, which is the stuff that we kind of alluded to when we talked about the trailer, which is, like, in adapting the movie for an American context, the movie makes a couple of good choices. And those good choices are that they largely play down the potential anti-Semitic subtext of Dal's original book. And they also then decide that we are going to use witches as a metaphor for white supremacy. And we're not going to be subtle about it at all. At one point, they march with their heels clicking like jackboots. They describe, the children that they want to destroy as rats or rodents or vermin, in case you don't get what they're getting at subtly there. At another point, Octavia Spencer talks about how the children who are taken are always those that won't be missed, in suggesting that there's predation happening specifically within particular communities and stuff like that. So, like, that aspect of it is clever and good. And, Zemeckis and co-writers, I think Guillermo del Toro and Kenya Barris, do good work there. However, when you're adapting, and this is something I think tends to happen when you're adapting, particularly, say, British or European stories for an American audience, is there tends to be a focus on stuff like the Campbellian narrative or the Save the Cat in terms of, like, plotting and structure, where everything in an American movie has to be big and larger than life and serve some sort of grand mythology and have a great purpose or a reason for what it's doing or why it's there. Everything has to fit as part of, like, a larger narrative and kind of part of a larger kind of story that you're telling. So here you get lots of information. Like, in the original, you do get backstory about the witches, but it's more like random folk tales and folk history and folk stories and stuff like that. Here you get very specifically, oh yeah, one of the characters has a very strong tie to another character, and it just so happens that they're meeting up again in this hotel, and it's all epic. And, in the original movie, the sequence in which the characters, like, deal with the witches, without getting into spoilers, they deal with the witches all at once, and it's like this big thing, and it's almost comedic. Like, it's a punchline at the end of the movie how that's resolved. And again, that's a very British sensibility. It's like, ha, these people thought they were big and important, but actually they're just going to get, attacked by Mr. Bean. That's the end of the movie. Whereas here, you have, like, that element borrowed, but you also then suddenly have, without getting too specific, a gigantic one-on-one showdown at the climax as well, where two characters stare at each other across a room and shout at each other and make, like, pointed veiled threats at one another. And then, we'll talk in the spoiler zone as well, but there's maybe, like, a credit/post-credit sequence, which is like, by the way, just so we're clear, this is also, like, something much, much bigger than this story about a lonely kid staying in a creepy hotel. And it's like, if you read The Witches and wanted to adapt The Witches, and your first instinct was, this is much bigger than the story of a small kid staying in a strange hotel, you maybe don't understand the appeal of it. It's like that story, that famous story they tell about pitching Phone Booth, where, Joel Schumacher says that, like, when the guy with the script for Phone Booth came along, he said, well, look, I pitched around town, all these directors love it, but I do remember one meeting in particular, and that meeting was with Michael Bay. And we sat down with Michael Bay and we went through the story step by step, script page by page. And Bay said, at the end of it, he kind of sat back in his chair and he said, I love it. I just have one question. How do we get him out of the phone booth? And it's like, if you're asking that question, you have fundamentally misunderstood the script that you've read. And, like, I feel like watching The Witches, like, when you get that stuff added to it, you fundamentally misunderstand what was appealing about the story in the first place. And in taking all that stuff out and putting in a bunch of generic stuff, you do a disservice to it. That's how,
it very much reminds me of the Tim Burton Charlie and the Chocolate Factory remake, which I believe misses a lot of the points of the book and the original film, where, like, we get an extended first act here, all that's dealing with, like, the death of the parents, the grandmother trying to get the young boy out of his sadness shell, extended sequences.
In the original film, that's 10 minutes. And also, by the way, in those 10 minutes, you get the entire backstory of witches. Like, that's it. In the original film, it's just boom, done.
boom, 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 boom.
Yeah.
Like they're like, remember, this is for children. They get it. Parents dead, kids sad, kid not sad. There's witches. Go, just go.
Bullet point. I love that. It's like ding, ding, ding. It's like
to put on my positivity hat.
yes.
If I can for a moment, Anne Hathaway is clearly having a great time.
Yes.
She seems to be understanding what her role in this movie is, which is to be a ham, to chew the scenery, give it 110%. She's doing great. And there were at least one, maybe one or two like genuinely creepy moments. I think the original transformation scene in the first Witches movie is something that those of us who grew up with it remember. We lock it in, much like a troll tearing his own flesh off in Willow, where it's like, that's your first introduction to weird body horror. That's great.
Yeah.
Here, there is a shot in which Anne Hathaway, as the Grand High Witch, reaches into an air vent that kids are crawling in, and her arms start like horribly growing and snapping and crackling, and that was genuinely creepy, and I really liked that. Yeah. The whole Grand High Witch meeting was fun-ish. Like, I feel like that was just them checking off a box, though, instead of really reveling in that sequence, you know, like, oh yeah, okay, the Grand High Witches are here. They all take off their wigs. They all take off their shoes and go, check. Yeah. Like, it felt so rushed.
Yeah. I will say, actually, like, if we're being positive about this film, because it's not terrible, to be absolutely clear. I think it's just, I agree with you, it's rather dull and rather bland and rather generic, which is unfortunate given the potential that we saw in, say, Rogue's adaptation and in the source material. And I always wonder if maybe I'm a little bit too harsh on things that I've, like, read or seen before, where it's like, I know you can do this well because I've seen other people do it well.
But that's why we should be harsh on it. Like, we've seen a better version of this.
Yeah. But, like, I will say, I actually quite like Gary Freeman's production design. Like, the stuff like the sets, when they're built, they're very hyper saturated. Like, things like the store, they're very colorful, they're very bright. It has that kind of like the entire thing is, without, again, not to get too spoilery, it's narrated by Chris Rock. So there's a sense in which we are hearing the story through the lens of memory. And so everything is kind of bright and saturated and hyper colorful, which again reflects the kind of memory of the 60s rather than the reality. And I will say, like, the costuming as well by Joanna Johnson, particularly like the costuming of the Grand High Witch with the purple dress and this kind of like ornate snake and stuff. Like, that stuff is actually really great. And it's the thing that really distracts me about bad CGI. I'm not one of those people who thinks the practical effects are always inherently better. There are times when you're using CGI and it is perfect for what you are doing with that CGI. Like, for, you know, I mean, typical examples, Martin Scorsese recreating, you know, Las Vegas in Casino, which is like one of the great uses of CGI, I would argue, in fact, because nobody notices it's CGI. But things like here, where like you have these wonderful sets and props, and then you have these awkward, juxtaposed, in no way realistic, kind of cartoonish CGI elements on top of it, and it doesn't really work, and it ends up making the sets look cheaper and the CGI look worse somehow, and they don't really work together. So yeah, no, again, like, it feels really bad that I'm like, I really like the production and the costume design, but they were ruined by this other thing. But I did actually really like the production design. I did really like the costume.
Yeah. No, and like, there's a lot of fun little details speaking just of Anne Hathaway's outfit, right? Like her little metal corset underneath, which is like a weird, creepy touch, the snake ornamentation, that sort of thing.
My personal favorite little thing is when they take off their wigs. There's the rests on the back of the chair, presumably for coats, but they all take off their wigs and hang them. And I do find it a little weird that they hang them on the seat behind them instead of the seat in front of them. But still, whatever works for you.
Well, because then you have to think about the front row. Where's the front row?
That's a fair point. Like, I've never been to a witches convention. Or a wig convention. That's fair. I'll accept
all
that.
I'm asking you to do is think about it for a second, Darren.
Fine, that's fair. I will own that. That's fair. You're right. The Witches is a masterpiece. I take back all of my criticisms of it. But like little touches like that, like the fact that the chairs have those hooks on them, and you can tell that the chairs have those hooks on them because when they were doing the scene, they're like, we need somewhere to hang the wigs, and it's like, yes, this is what I'm looking for. Like, if more of the movie had been like that, had been that kind of like, so kind of surreally perfectly designed for this completely unnatural or uncanny thing, I'd be like, yeah, give me that. Here's a question for you, actually, because you are like a responsible parent, as we've discussed in the podcast repeatedly before. My big issue with the witches, and it's like, it's probably a very small, very petty thing, but my big issue with this version of the witches is that I cannot imagine any child of a reasonable age, so about say 8 or 10, watching this and having nightmares and like being unable to sleep. And so like, whereas the witches back in 1990, I didn't sleep for quite a while after that. Like, or the child catcher from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. I didn't sleep for ages after that. As somebody, did you watch this with your kids, or would you feel comfortable showing this to your kids? And if this was something that might give like children nightmares, as a parent, is it better or worse that it does or doesn't?
These are all good questions. I did not.
Okay.
I did not end up showing it to my kids, mostly because we're recording this on the day it came out. So I actually had to watch it this morning before the podcast.
While your kids were in school. I really hope you teased them with that. I was like, you guys are in school. I'm watching a movie.
They were doing homework. They came in here between classes, and I said, you can't watch. Nah.
It's great being grown up.
You're absolutely correct in saying that there is nothing too scary about this movie. I would not show it to them just because I think they would be bored.
That's a fair point. That's also a good reason not to show it to them.
So no, there's nothing like offensive. There's nothing like too scary. And for me, like I love scary movies. I love horror movies. And so I'm always looking for those stepping stones. We talked about this a little bit during, when we talked about like Hubie Halloween.
Yeah.
Which is like, I'm looking for movies that help acclimate them to horror movies, because one day they're going to be old enough and I can watch whatever I want during Halloween. And so like, to me, this is just dull. Like I don't think a kid will have a good time watching this.
That's fair. I did not have a good time watching this.
They're going to be so bored, and there's no wow moment that will make that boredom worth it.
Yeah,
it's all just it's a slog. It really it's I don't want to like throw around worthless, but I just said it and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably happy that a lot of the people involved got paid to make this, I guess, is probably the thing. Anne Hathaway had a lot of fun.
Anytime Stanley Tucci is working, I'm happy. He's he's great.
Yeah, he's having a good time. He looked like he was having a good time on that set. He got to wear a costume. He got to style his hair. He got to dress up fancy.
And Anne Hathaway's like, can I do a funny accent that's not really from anywhere? Yeah, go ahead, Anne. You do it.
Nobody's going to tell you no. You won your Oscar. You just go for it. The weird thing with the Glasgow smiles the witches have, it's a small thing, but it's like, I thought, like, for me, in the original Witches, what was scary about the witches was that any woman could be a witch, or any person could be a witch. And it's like, no, they all have to look vaguely like Heath Ledger's Joker now. And it's like, I feel like as a kid, that takes away a lot of the potential scare of, like, the witches as a concept, where any seemingly nice old lady could turn out to want to, like, eat you, or, spoiler, turn you into a mouse, unspoiler. But here it's like any kindly old lady who just happens to have a Glasgow smile. That's what you're on the lookout for. If there's no Glasgow smile, you're fine. Yeah.
Oh, right. Well, and similarly, and I know this delves a little bit into the anti-Semitism, but like the giant witch nose in the original, obviously delving into some darker side of Roald Dahl. But here they had like cartoon nostrils expand in order to sniff out the children.
Like a horny wolf. It's like a horny wolf in a cartoon. Like it's
exactly. And so it's like, once again, it's like, oh, well, that takes away from like that face-off reveal of the witches, which I'm sure there were many meetings about noses and proper quality standards as far as new media is concerned. So no, it's just so dull. The what am I trying to think of? The weird everything beyond the first act feels really rushed because the first act feels really long. And I actually had a weird HBO Max glitch. So I watched this, right here on my computer via HBO Max, and for some reason the progress bar wouldn't go away. And so not only is this a very long, boring movie, but I can actually see the seconds slowly tick by because of a weird glitch in the HBO Max player. And so it just made everything feel extra long.
You are 2 hours closer to death.
But like, the friendship with the little kid, the little mouse that he had who turned out to be another little kid, I guess, like it
feels like one character too many, even that.
Too many and too fast. It's just like go, 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 go. Yeah. It's where it's like you had no setup to your payoff, which felt like it robbed me of a lot of the fun horrorness of this Halloween movie.
And just one more quick thing, I promise, before I stop kicking the movie, or before I stop kicking the movie without going into spoilers. But okay. Just very quickly, the management of tone of the movie, which is very odd, because it's like it. Again, this is the thing where I wonder, is it a thing of adapting a British story for American sensibilities? Where, like, again, at the risk of being kind of culturally insensitive or kind of cultural cliches, like British art, and particularly British art aimed at children, tends to be a lot more, or allow itself to be a lot more wry and cynical than like typical children's entertainment in the United States. And again, let's not delve too much into that, but like generally speaking, there's a sense of, it's self-aware, it's very cold, it's not particularly pleasant or welcoming, it's very arch, and it's not afraid to like joke and scare children at the same time. Whereas when you're watching The Witches, it feels like Zemeckis isn't able to do all of the things that The Witches needs to do at the same time, so he switches between them constantly and in ways that don't necessarily work. So like without getting too spoilery, there's a key sequence in the movie where one of the children has an opportunity to talk to his parents and ask for help in the situation in which they find themselves. And it's like, this should be a moment which is like, well, he's reaching out. It's very tense. Like, it's got to be very tense. It's got to be wryly, darkly funny because the parents aren't paying attention and aren't listening and don't necessarily love their kid, which is like a very British thing to have in a children's movie. It's like, imagine your parents didn't love you, witches would be the least of your problems. But because Zemeckis can't do tone, it ends up becoming a fat joke where he's too busy stuffing his face to say, hey, mom, hey, dad, I could kind of use your help right now. And it's like, yeah, well, what are you doing? What's the point of the scene? And like throughout, there's these moments where the score by Ellen Silvestri, again, Bob Zemeckis' like longtime collaborator, will be like, now you feel sad. I'm going to hit the piano. And it's like, now you feel whimsical. And I'm going to hit several keys very quickly. Yep. And like, it's just, and it never picks one tone, and it always bounces between them with no warning.
And what I'm going to say is let's go full into spoilers now, because everyone knows how we feel about it now. So we're about like, if you are worried about us all, if you are worried at all about us spoiling the new The Witches, which, I mean, most people know the story by now. So well, we are spoiling from here on out. Be warned. So like that sequence in particular where the fat little friend is now a mouse and the grandma holds him up to the parents, like they don't even get a close up of the mouse. We don't even know what the mouse is necessarily doing. And that's all we see is the grandma in a pretty wide or like medium wide shot just holding out her hand with a mouse. And it's silent. It's dead air for 15 seconds. And we're like, what the hell's going on here? And the kid's just like, oh, yeah, I was eating.
Like, Dad doesn't like it when I talk with my mouth full. And it's like, that's a punchline. That's not a punchline in this scene. That's not how you put a pin in this dramatic moment where the kids realize that his parents don't love him. It's like...
And then we get a throwaway line 20 minutes later to say, oh, yeah, his parents didn't want him back, so we kept him at our house.
What I will say, actually, to give some small credit, and when I say some small credit, like this is one of those eyes bigger than its belly moments for the film. One of the things that The Witches does, now that we're in full spoiler mode, that the original doesn't, is that it retains Dahl's original ending, where Dal didn't have the child turned back at the end of his book. In fact, Dal was
Mm.
very, very upset. He loved the casting of Angelica Houston in the 1990 version. He thought that was fantastic. But when he saw the movie and he heard that they weren't changing the ending of his movie, he apparently picketed his local cinema. He was that upset that they changed the mouse back into a boy because he felt like it undermined the cynical ending of his own text. So
Oh, sure.
it's kind
Sure.
of, I find it interesting that Zemeckis' adaptation actually commits to that, actually goes there, actually keeps its child as a mouse, and like retains what is theoretically that bleak ending of, by the way, your parents don't want you back, so I guess you're staying with us. Which again, like, is a very British story beat. Well, your parents don't love you, but that's okay. Stiff up a lip, boy. We'll take care of it. And it's like, but like, it's played here as so saccharine and so sincere and so unearned. And then there's the post-credit sequence. And I kind of, like, I joked, I said earlier that there's no part of this that's going to give kids nightmares, and I stand by that. But there are moments that came very, very close to giving me nightmares. And that is the completely unphotorealistic version of Chris Rock as a mouse, who is also seemingly a cult leader, who is also seemingly building an army of adorable children, to be absolutely clear, that he is funding using money that he stole from a dead witch to franchise his witch-killing operation, working them up into a dramatic fervor. And by the way, it is the most intense moment in the film. Like, we talk about the witch reveal earlier in the film. The witch reveal has nothing on this. The moment where the kids are like, what are you going to do? Kill witches! What are you going to do? Now!
Any mercy? No mercy. Any mercy? No mercy. Oh, and then we see like old man mouse. Like he has like a comical receding hairline. And we discover that the Chris Rock as our narrator is an old man mouse teaching a group of children how to kill witches by telling them this very boring witch killing story.
But which gets them really psyched. Like that's like the most, it was like, it's the weirdest moment, because again, it's one of those things where the movie misjudges its own tone. I get the sense that, like, as a kid watching it, you're supposed to be like, yeah, kid empowerment, they're gonna show those adults are witches. And it's like, as an adult I'm watching, it's like, this is kind of like, this is vaguely Triumph of the Will-esque.
Yes.
Like I'm waiting for the
very
low angle
Jonestown.
shot. Yeah, I'm waiting for the low angle shot of like the mouse at the podium as he says, no, we will take care of these witches.
We've been wipe out some witches.
Yeah,
Right.
like you're waiting for, like, because like that's the start of it plays over the opening part of the credits, and what I was expecting was it to come back later in the credits with this kind of like found footage zombie movie sort of like shaky camera, like news footage of kids around the world started brutally murdering their parents with no warning whatsoever. It's like we have footage of kids in the street, and it's like these kids just running around apparently with like knives, I guess, or like magic potions, just sort of splashing them on random adults. It's like
Yes, it's very, very strange. And apparently, the boy, his mouse friends, the grandma went on a witch killing spree.
There's a lovely
in
shot
their
of, like,
RV.
Octavia Spencer outside like Mount Rushmore with her little witch killing RV, but she has like the number of witches that she's killed like imprinted on the side.
Kind of like you would do on a World War II fighter plane. Yes.
And it's like the tone of the scene is like, look at how bright and colorful this is, and how like happy Octavia Spencer is. And look, I'm happy that Octavia Spencer's happy. That woman is a gift. But it's like, I feel like maybe this moment isn't what you want it to be. It's like, how many mistakes do they make? How many like poor innocent people who just happen to have Glasgow smiles got randomly turned into mice?
Listen, I fell into some barbed wire when I was younger. I just have these scars. I swear, I'm not a.
Yeah, take that, Tina Fey.
Yeah.
Like, Jesus.
Yeah, it gets weird. It's. Yeah, tone deaf might be the point. Might be the right thing to say, or just trying, or so tone fluent that you're hopping back and forth between them all so fast that we can't really lock on. The idea that there needed to be a narrator in any situation is weird, like just on a storytelling filmmaking standpoint, because we get what's happening through the visuals alone. We don't need Chris Rock to tell us that the kid is sad.
You also have like Octavia Spencer's grandmother, who serves as a narrator within a narrator. There are moments where she offers backstory and exposition, and you're like, what? Like, that's grand. That's the framing device. You don't need a bigger framing device around your framing device. That's why this movie is 2 hours long.
Was that just so they could get another A-lister in there?
I do wonder, because you have to imagine this was like 4 hours for Chris Rock, right? Unless he did motion capture for the mouse. If he did motion capture for the mouse, I would have some words with Robert Zemeckis. But yeah,
no, I can only assume this was just an effort to shoehorn in another name, and specifically a name that you could put in your trailer,
in your poster. Yeah, that's exactly.
Yeah. So it's just so gosh darn boring is the only thing you can say about the movie.
But until it turns into like surreal kind of like, I want like the kind of, the George A. Romero-esque sequel to The Witches, where like people are trying to figure out why all of a sudden kids started like brutally murdering adults and turning them into mice. Like I want that movie. I want that kind of like found footage horror where the last adults on Earth are just kind of scurrying through the rubble, like as Chris Rock's like weird mouse, uber mouse, I guess is what he is at this point.
Yes. It's like a decade down the line, they're all like teenagers, young adults now, and they're like ruling over society with modern day literal witch trials. Yeah. Well, this could be a really great movie.
Like it feels like, I want the sequel to The Witches, not The Witches, it turns out. No more Mr. Mice Guy.
You did it.
I did. I got there in the end.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. The only other really weird note for me, and I'm not sure how much of this was in the book, as it's been a solid minute since I've read the original book. The insistence that the grandma was a very religious person. Grandma mentioned like God's plan several times, and this is a woman who both uses voodoo magic and knows that real life witches exist. But apparently also God has a plan for everyone. And so like that note kept being hit a lot throughout the movie.
And by the way, that note was on Alan Silvestri's piano, in case listeners are ambiguous.
Ha, ha, ha. And so, to me, that was a really weird thing that they kept hammering home. It's just like, oh, God's plan. Yep. So I guess God's plan is you're a mouse now. And like, lady, a witch turned me into a mouse. How does God have anything to do with that?
Well, again, that's that kind of like epic myth building around it. The fact that she's a voodoo priestess at all as well. And like apparently can mix like witches' potions in her sleep and stuff like that. Yeah, it all like it screams of like wanting there to be an epic framework on the story that you're telling. And it's like, no, it can just be a story about stranger danger in a weird hotel. That's enough. I don't need societal revolution. I don't need like God's plan. Sorry, that makes it sound like I'm being anti-religious. I don't need God's plan. In The Witches, I do not need God's plan.
And you know what? If you want to make it a societal revolutionary film, like you said, there is a lot of themes of like the evils of white supremacy. Of course, none of those themes play out when it comes to like black people at an all-white up-class hotel. Like none of that is ever brought up for the grandmother and her grandson staying at a classy white hotel
in Alabama
in the South.
in 1968. Like
right.
And again, like the choice of 1968 is very pointed. It's late 1968, which is a point at which the United States was going through all this turbulence related to what's going on. And it's like, yes, I'm just going to be a black woman who's going to check into this fancy rich hotel and get a really nice room there. Because there are moments where it seems like Tushi's manager is maybe going to like be there. And it's going to be like, oh, I see what they're doing. They're going to give us a subtle metaphor for like the real evil that isn't the cartoonish witch's evil. But it's like, no, he's just being genuine. He did give her a really nice room.
It's like it's a black family that is going to a upper class white hotel specifically because witches don't steal upper class white children, and they make no commentary on race whatsoever.
Once they get there,
it seems like they've either lost something in editing or just figured they didn't want to deal with that.
It's like, how much is enough? I think we have enough. Like, it's like the moment where they all stand up like kind of like stormtroopers when Anne Hathaway walks into the room. That's enough. Or like the moment where their heels click like jackboots. I was like, I feel like I admire that you're committing to it, but I feel like you're maybe over committing to this part of it. I would rather you kind of like spread it like butter across the movie rather than
exactly like make it an overarching theme. That could have been really nice, but again, just either they didn't care to or decided that they didn't want to deal specifically with actual racist only witches.
The great thing about witches is you can defeat them in the end, as the movie tells us. Thank goodness we defeated white supremacy in late 1968.
Awkward pause.
Yeah.
Awkward pause. Yeah. Star wipe away.
Think that's a good call.
A good idea.
I think that's a good idea.
All right. Well, that was a lovely discussion. Thank you so much, Darren, for watching Willow. I needed that this week. It was great.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for asking me to watch Willow. I've been meaning to watch Willow for a while. And I did enjoy it despite my protestations and being a cruel single bastard.
It's such a good movie. Because it's such a good movie and Val Kilmer is very charming. So
don't push your luck,
all
Jack.
the time. All the time.
In every role.
In every role, all the time. Thank you all for listening and or watching this, the Escapist Movie Podcast. Once again, I've been Jack Packard.
I've been Darren Mooney.
And goodbye.